All right, welcome to What Does the Bible Say? Making some final notes here in preparation because we have got a barn burner for you. We're dealing with this evening a call that came in several weeks ago, but we got a little bit distracted from a caller that wanted to call in and discuss the Godhead, one of the Godhead, in which I'm needing to clarify something on that call as well. I made a statement that was a preacher from New Jersey, or a pastor rather from New Jersey, and I found out later that in fact that was not the pastor that I was expecting to call in, but it was one of the pastor's members. And you might be saying, well, how do you think it was one of the pastors? Well, I was talking to Dad earlier. He was in contact with somebody from Louisiana, and the individual from Louisiana was saying that the pastor might call in. So when the call came in, that topic came up, I assumed, because of what I knew, the information that I had at the time, that it was that pastor. But it wasn't the pastor, it was one of his members. Now, but even so, clarification on that, wasn't the pastor from New Jersey, but we have individuals from Louisiana that have been in contact with those individuals in New Jersey, trying to encourage them and challenge them. Hey, you think you've got something? Call into these folks and see what happens. Couldn't get the pastor, got one of the members. So just wanted to make a clarifying statement on that. What are we dealing with this evening that's got so many individuals stirred up? Well, number one, what has individuals stirred up about it is you're not paying attention to what it is that we're actually saying, and you're wanting to jump to an extreme conclusion off of something, a presupposition that we did not even say. And in particular, what it is that we're dealing with on Facebook, it's simply a red herring, a false argument thrown out so as to distract from what the real argument is. And basically, you have a Pharisee type of mentality in that individuals in the Baptist denomination are simply just wanting to try to find fault so as to remove any type of argumentation, authority that an individual might be able to present. So right there, not able to deal with the argument itself, but you got to attack the person. Ad hominem, along with red herring there. So this is What Does the Bible Say? Micah Robertson here with you tonight. We're glad that you tuned in. Feel free to contact us, call us, email us, find us on Facebook, leave comments on the YouTube channel. Come out and assemble with us. Visit with the brethren, 120 American Legion Boulevard. Caleb Robertson will be live. I think we might be live this coming Thursday. I know that that's Thanksgiving, but we're in talks about possibly doing a show. I know that's news to those in the control room. But that is in the works, because we know a lot of people will be at home. They'll be gathered together with their family, and so we want to take that great opportunity, if we can, to be able to present more information. And since I've already mentioned the folks in the control room, I want to give them a big thank you for putting us on tonight. I know that Matt Smith is involved very heavily with the parades that go on here with Star News, and he was involved with the parade today, and heavily involved in that. And he's here with us tonight, making sure that we're able to get on no strings attached. So I want to say a big thank you to he and his wife for their helping us with that this evening. So tonight, let's start with the call, so as to establish where it is that we're going. Now, as we're discussing this, we mentioned last time, before we were diverted with the call, this isn't just necessarily a time of study or discussion about mechanical instruments of music. Really what this is properly understanding Bible authority. How can we all pick up the Bible, this one book, read it together, and come out with the same understanding on matters? Because in fact, that's exactly what we're supposed to be doing. Paul wrote to those brethren at Corinth, and he did not say to them that they could just simply have their own understanding on things, but that they were to be speaking the same thing, that there be no divisions among you, that you be perfectly joined together in the same mind and in the same judgment. If this is a teaching that's going on at Corinth, 1 Corinthians chapter 4, Paul said that he would send Timothy and that he would remind them of all the things that he preached in all the churches. So what's being taught here in Corinth is the same thing that he would be presenting in Antioch, throughout Corinth is in Achaia, Macedonia, Thessalonica, Berea, Lystra, Galatia, Ephesus, all those areas. What is it that Paul is encouraging? Be of the same mind. Well, the only way that we're going to be able to be of the same mind is that we've got to come to the same conclusions on things. And so that's what we're dealing with tonight. We're just simply using mechanical instruments of music as a jumping off point. We're going to discuss sprinkling. We're going to discuss burning incense. A lot of things. How to take care of widows and the poor. A lot of that's going to be inserted this evening as we're looking at, well, what does the Bible actually say on these matters? So here's what we're dealing with.
All right, good
evening, caller. What's the Bible say?
You said this is what the Bible says?
This is what does the Bible say?
All right. So do y'all believe in mechanical instruments in worship service today?
No, we do not find the New Testament teaching that we can use mechanical instruments of music, mechanical instruments of music in worship today.
So what if I tell you that I can prove what mechanical instruments is not a commandment, but we have permission to use it in worship service today?
You're going to have to prove it from the New Testament.
All scriptures are given by the inspiration
No,
of God.
sir, we're not under the Old Testament today. Christ
Say
came.
in the Old Testament, if
Christ?
it was said, and then if the New Testament didn't condemn it, then it mean it went on through.
No, Christ said he came to do the will of the one that sent him. So we're going to stop it there, and we're going to use a little bit more of the same call as we move forward. Here's what the argument is. We do not have a command so as to do it. But this caller wants to say, but hey, I can find permission for it. Well, if that's the case, and that's how we're going to operate this thing, I can find permission for a lot of things that were under the Old Testament system, that in fact we would have no authority for today, and that would in fact be unscriptural and would go against some other things that were clearly taught in the New Testament. We're not simply going off of the basis of permission, but that we actually have to have some authority in the New Testament for what it is that we do, whether it be by direct command and an explicit statement, or by implication and inference. Now, on that grounds of permission, we're not just going off of permission alone. When we, in order to have permission on something, you've got to have one of those first three. You have to have some clarification, some distinction that, okay, this is what we're supposed to do. For example, we're jumping a bit ahead, but when we're looking at James chapter 1 and verse 27, it says, visit the fatherless and the widows. We have a lot of room as to how that's going to be done. We can find instances in the Old Testament system. They had the tithing system going on, and the widows and the fatherless and the poor, they were to partake of the tithes just like the Levites were. The Israelites were not to glean all of their field. They were to leave the corners for the poor, the fatherless, and the widows so that they could be taken care of. When we have the command given to the church that, okay, you are supposed to take care of widows, Acts chapter 6, you have the brethren in Jerusalem, and they're choosing out 6 men to be over this office, to be over this work, and that those 6 men were to be involved in orchestrating, making sure all these things were being done. You have the Thessalonian letter. Let me see here, check my notes. I'm getting a lot of stuff's going around right now, and I'm getting a little sidetracked. 1 Timothy chapter 5, verses 3 through 16. You have specifications being given as to who actually is a widow that you're supposed to help, who are other widows that are not needing to be helped. There's a certain age limit or age bracket that would qualify somebody as being a widow indeed that the church is supposed to help. Does it say directly how the church is supposed to help? Well, no, we have an example in Acts chapter 6, how that there were 6 men and they were involved in ministering to these individuals. So, okay, if we actually establish 6 men and they're over these things, does that have to be inside of the assembly building that we have, or could we not actually have another place, another building, to where these widows and orphans are being taken care of? And can then other brethren who do not have the means to rent out a place, buy out a place so these individuals can be taken care of, can they send funds over to another congregation that is doing that work? Well, yes, they would be able to do that. We're looking at all this and we're trying to find, are there explicit commands that are given on this? Or do we not actually have areas of expediency whereby if we're doing this thing decently and in order, so that all individuals are being taken care of, is not the same thing being accomplished? All right, we understand. Some things are going to be grandfathered in under a realm of, okay, they have permission to do this, even though it's not explicitly stated. But the thing is you're going to have to show me where those passages are. So what it is that we're not dealing with tonight, and the caller stated it very well, we're dealing with the use of mechanical instruments of music in worship. Not in everyday life, not in forms of entertainment. I'm at home and my wife is playing the piano. There's nothing inherently sinful about a mechanical instrument of music. The problem that we're having today is that we are wanting to know from you, where is the authority in the New Testament for that to be used in worship? And then there are individuals on Facebook trying to pull off in all these type of different directions. Micah Robertson is listening to John Mayer. I'm not listening to everything John Mayer puts out. Just because George Strait has the song called The Fireman, does that mean that I can't listen to Check Yes or No? Is there something wrong with Check Yes or No? No, there's nothing wrong with Check Yes or No. But you got these ding-dongs saying that anything that's godless, you have no business being in. Well, all right then, let's see you cut out the book, the Song of Solomon. God's name is not mentioned one time in that book. That is a godless book. And it deals primarily nothing more than the relationship between a husband and a wife. If that's how we're going to be, I mean, you want to talk about straining at gnats, swallowing camels. That's what we've got going on in the denominational realm, because they cannot properly deal with the argumentation. And for individuals, I mean, you've got individuals, and I'm trying not to get too distracted with this information, but when we're looking at what's going on, I mean, for example, if I were, let's spin it this way. Let's say I was not a member of the Church of Christ, that I was in a denomination, the Baptist Church in particular, received Jesus into my heart as my personal Savior, fully trusting in what He did on the cross, and I listened to John Mayer. Am I going to hell? I know the answer is going to be no. Then shut up about it. If you cannot actually lay any clear condemnation on the situation, then you have no business trying to find fault where there is none. And there's nothing wrong with all secular music. The individual even said that on Facebook. Well, there's nothing wrong with all secular music. Then get out of here, if that's how you're going to be. Just clearly trying to be difficult, because why? Can't deal with what's actually being discussed in worship. And for some individuals saying, well, what's the distinction between everyday life and worship? Well, if there was no distinction, then why would we have the Bible making a distinction? If everything we do is worship, then why, when we come to passages like Exodus chapter 4 and verse 31, that when Moses came to Aaron and they got the elders together and they relayed the message that God had given to Moses, that the people believed, and when they heard that the Lord had visited the children of Israel and that He had looked upon their affliction, then they bowed their heads and worshiped. If everything is worship, then there's no need for this clarification. There's no need for this distinction. This is a clear, separate, determined act that's taking place. They bowed their heads and they worshiped. Genesis chapter 22 and verse 5. Look at what we have here. Everything that we do is not worship. And Abraham said unto his young men, Abide ye here with the ass, and I and the lad will go yonder and worship. You mean everything Abraham was doing? You mean Abraham's not worshiping all the time? No, Abraham's not worshiping all the time, and neither are you. Everything that you're doing is not worship. Now, in being a Christian, I have rules and regulations and commandments that are put upon me, that the things that I do involve myself in, what do they have to be? They have to be wholesome, they have to be pure, righteous. It doesn't have to be worship. When I'm at work, do you think I'm worshiping God while I'm at work? No, that's a separate act. But when I'm at work, are there not rules and regulations placed upon me by Scripture of how I'm supposed to be? Yes, there are. Ephesians chapter 5. You go to work, this is how you behave. This is how you labor. Does God get glory in that? Yes, God gets glory in that, but all glorification is not found through worship. Glorification can be found through my work. Matthew chapter 5. You do these good deeds for what purpose? So that your Father in heaven may be glorified. Worship and work are not the same. And everything that I'm involved in is not worship. And so what if I'm over here involved in some form of relaxation entertainment? As long as it's wholesome, pure, then these individuals that want to try to throw stones, they can just throw all the stones they want to. I mean, you take, for example, Titus chapter 1 and verse 15. What are we actually dealing with here tonight with these folks in the Baptist church? Unto the pure, all things are pure. Now you see right there, if I can in fact be watching something, viewing something, and it does not clearly have some type of explicit or just vulgar or whatever that you want to try to imply in it, or you wouldn't even have to imply it, just be right there. Then what of it? Unto the pure all things are pure, but unto them that are defiled and unbelieving is nothing pure. If you're wanting to just go through and just try to find any type of fault and try to twist anything and make it to whatever you want to be, hey, if you're an unbelieving and defiled person, then that's what you'll be able to do. But even their mind and conscience is defiled. That's exactly what we got going on, trying to defer and detract and distract from what it is that we're actually dealing with. Now, here's the other problem with that. If you're going to throw stones because I'm involved in things that would be, as the person on Facebook said, are godless, then you're going to have to hold Paul, the Apostle Paul, to the same type of standard. In Acts chapter 17, in verse 25, I believe it is, what do we have here? 28. For in him, Paul says, for in him we live and move and have our being, as certain also of your own poets have said, for we are also his offspring. Whose poets? Well, that's the poets of Athens. Paul is over here on Mars Hill, and what does it say about this place in verse 16? Now while Paul waited for them at Athens, his spirit was stirred in him when he saw the city wholly given to idolatry. Well, what's Paul doing reading these godless poets? Listen, you don't think that Paul can pick up some of their material, leave out the bad stuff, turn away from the bad stuff, and those things which are okay to read, actually read it? If you're going to lay that charge on me, lay it on Paul. Not only does he deal with the poets, Titus chapter 1 and verse 12. Excuse me, my verse 12, not verse 2. What do we have here? In talking about the people at Crete, notice what else he does. One of themselves, even a prophet of their own. So now we've jumped from a poet over here to a prophet, a foreteller, a future teller. And Paul quotes one of them and says, the Cretans are always liars, evil beasts, slow bellies. Well, what's Paul doing reading this godless material? Listen, if Paul is able to pick up the poets of his day and read them, am I going to jump to an evil conclusion that, well, Paul is picking up and reading stuff he ought not be reading? All of their stuff is clearly not bad. And the things that are bad, push them to the side. And individuals that are trying to make these type of charges, they're holding up a standard that they themselves would not be willing to lift with their own finger, little finger. Matthew chapter 23, Jesus said of the people of his day, and all we simply have are just individuals trying to find fault. Trying to find fault instead of dealing with what the argumentation actually is. If you're wanting to listen to music that some secular artist is making, as long as it's pure, fine. And then on top of that, you're not needing to take what belongs to God and profane it so that I can then use it for my own satisfaction and for my own entertainment. This individual on Facebook saying, well, I listen to hymns all the time, or Christian music, as if Christian artists are any better than the secular artists. When Caleb and I were down in Danville and we were dealing with the Episcopal Church on their pub night, there's Christians, and they're getting together at the church building to drink beer and listen to music. This guy's going in, trying to ask him Bible questions, going into an Episcopal church, and he's just saying, hey man, I'm just here to play a gig. Your Christian artists are going in and out of everywhere playing music just because, hey, I got a gig, I like to play music. So to act like, oh, you're so much more holy and righteous than we are, man, don't give me that. Your Christian artists are on the same level as these other people. And just because they're not Christians does not mean that everything that they write is going to be filled with filth. There's plenty of good music that's out there that can be enjoyed by particular artists, and things that are not able to be enjoyed, push it to the side. So let's get back on track as to what we are dealing with. Let me go back and just play it again. All right, good evening, caller. You're on What's the Bible Say?
All right. You said this is what the Bible says?
This is what does the Bible say?
All right. So do y'all believe in mechanical instruments in worship service today?
No, we do not find the New Testament teaching that we can use mechanical instruments of music in worship today.
So what if I tell you that I can prove what mechanical instruments is not a commandment, but we have permission to use it in worship service today?
You're going to have to prove it from the New Testament.
All scriptures are given by the inspiration
No,
of God.
sir, we're not under the Old Testament today. Christ
It's
came.
in the Old Testament. If
Christ?
it said, and then if the New Testament didn't condemn it, then it mean it went on through.
No, Christ. So that's where we're wanting to go first. No commandment, but we have permission. Well, all right, if we have permission, you're going to have to find permission for me in the New Testament. That's where we're worshiping. That's where we're getting our ordinances from, our commandments from. Show it to me in the New Testament. He wants to try to say, well, if it's not condemned in the New Testament, then it came through the Old Testament. It came on through. But here's the situation, folks. We're not getting our authority from Moses anymore. In Acts chapter 3 and verse 22, for Moses truly said unto the fathers, a prophet shall the Lord your God raise up unto you of your brethren, like unto me, him shall ye hear in all things whatsoever he shall say unto you. I'm not listening to Moses. Now, I'm not trying to undermine or diminish what Moses did, and we're going to deal with that in just a moment. But for Moses himself to say, this is very similar to like what John the Baptist said. John the Baptist said of himself, I must decrease so that he can increase. You've been listening to me, now you're needing to listen to him. There's going to be a prophet. He's going to be like me. Listen to whatever he says unto you. So what did Jesus say about the matter? Matthew chapter 5, verse 17, think not that I am come to destroy the law or the prophets. I am not come to destroy, but to fulfill. What did Jesus say about the law and the prophets? They were going to come to an end. You fulfill something, you accomplish something, what do you do with it? You set it to the side. And you have that very thing being stated in Ephesians chapter 2, verses 14 through 15. For he is our peace, who hath made both one, and hath broken down the middle wall of partition between us, having abolished in his flesh the enmity, even the law of commandments contained in ordinances, for to making himself of twain one new man, so making peace. What are we doing with the law of Moses? It's been fulfilled. It hasn't been destroyed, it's not been annihilated, but it has been abolished. That word abolished means literally, figuratively, abolish, to cease, deliver, destroy, do away, to become of no effect, make of no effect, none effect, of none effect, or without effect. To fail, loose, bring to naught, come to naught, put away, to put down, vanish away, to make void. I'm not going back and listening to, if I can say it this way without being too condescending, that lesser prophet. Moses did what it was that he was set to accomplish. He did that. We now have the prophet that we're needing to listen to. So I'm going to take what Christ says on the matter. Hebrews chapter 3, 5 and 6. Let's give Moses his due. Moses verily was faithful in all his house as a servant for a testimony of those things which were to be spoken after. But here's the contrast, and here's the superiority of Christ. But Christ as a son over his own house, whose house are we if we hold fast the confidence and the rejoicing of the hope firm unto the end? Who are we to listen to? Who has the authority? Moses was faithful in all his house as a servant. But what about Jesus? What about Christ? Christ as a son over his own house. So he wasn't just a son in the house, he was a son over his own house. Moses was just a servant that's in there. So when we're thinking about this, that's what we're dealing with when we're thinking about where are we getting permission. And as we said, if we're going to use his line of reasoning, that's going to get him in a whole lot of mess, a whole lot of trouble. Here's Hebrews chapter 10 and verse 7. Then said I, this is a reference to Jesus. What did he come to do? I come in the volume of the book as it is written of me to do thy will, O God. Above when he said, sacrifice and offering and burnt offerings, and offering for sin thou wouldest not, neither hadst pleasure therein, which are offered by the law. Then said he, Lo, I come to do thy will, O God. He taketh away the first, law of Moses, commandments and ordinances, that he may establish the second, by the which will we are sanctified through the offering of the body of Jesus Christ once for all. Which will, which testament is it that we're under that is involved in sanctifying us? It's the one that has established the offering of the body of Jesus Christ once for all. That's the will and that's the testament. We're under the second. We're not going back to the first. Now, if you're not up on what's going on here, then you would have individuals being able to manipulate you and misuse you and mislead you into doing things that you really have no business doing. Romans 15:4, for whatsoever things were written aforetime were written for our learning, that we through patience and comfort of the Scripture might have hope. It's there for our learning. It's not there for our authority. If I'm wanting to get clarification on some of the things that are going on under the New Testament system, let's just jump ahead to something right quick. I don't think I have this in my PowerPoint, but it just kind of came to me off the top of my head. 2 Corinthians chapter 9, verses 6 and 7. This I say, he which soweth sparingly shall reap also sparingly, and he which soweth bountifully shall reap also bountifully. Every man according as he purposed in his heart, so let him give, not grudgingly over necessity, for God loveth the cheerful giver. For God is able to make all grace abound toward you, that you always having all sufficiency in all things may abound to every good work. As it is written, he hath dispersed abroad, he hath given to the poor, his righteous remaineth forever. Now he that ministereth seed to the sower, both minister bread for your food, and multiply your seed sown, and increase the fruits of your righteousness. When we're looking at the command that's being given here about giving, where does it actually go back to establish the principle? It goes back to as it is written. This is actually an Old Testament reference. This idea about sowing sparingly, reaping sparingly, not gathering more than what they were actually in need of. Let me see here. Being enriched in everything to all bountifulness which causeth through us thanksgiving to God. Let's see. It might be 2 Corinthians chapter 8. Let's see. There was a reference here about not taking in more than what they were actually needing. There it is. Let's see. For I mean not that other men be eased and ye be burdened, but by an equality that now at this time your abundance may be a supply for their want, that their abundance also may be a supply for your want, that there may be equality. As is written, he hath gathered much, he that had gathered much had nothing over, and he that had gathered little had no lack. What's the principle that we're dealing with? This is back in the book of Exodus when God rained down manna from heaven. So if I'm wanting to understand what the command about giving is all about and how it's supposed to be operated and what's the mentality and the spirit that's supposed to be done in, I need to go back to the book of Exodus and learn about this situation right here. How am I to look at my giving? He that had gathered much had nothing over, and he that had gathered little had no lack. God is going to take care of it. God is going to equal it all out for the giving that's being done here. Well, you see, here's the thing. That took us back to the Old Testament. They tithed in the Old Testament, so that means that we can tithe here because it referenced the Old Testament. No, we can't do that. Because 1 Corinthians chapter 16, verses 1 and 2 gives us further information as to how this is needing to be done. Now, you see what I just did there? If you're not aware of what these other passages are saying, I could go to 2 Corinthians chapter 8 and show you that's an Old Testament reference since it's in the Old Testament and it doesn't condemn tithing, we need to start tithing. And that's not proper interpretation. That's not proper way in gathering authority. Here's what the New Testament says on giving. How is the church supposed to give? Take up a collection. Upon the first day of the week, let every one of you lay by him in store as God has prospered him, that there be no gatherings when I come. There's no amount, no tithe. It's as you've been prospered that you're supposed to give. Go back to 2 Corinthians chapter 9 and verse 6 again. This I say, he which soweth sparingly shall reap also sparingly. He which soweth bountifully shall reap also bountifully. Every man according as he purposeth in his heart, so let him give, not grudgingly or of necessity, for God loveth a cheerful giver. It cannot be of necessity. If I came along and said to the members there at Martinsville, Virginia, you all, everybody across the board has to give 10%. I just laid a necessity upon them. That's not what God is looking for under the New Testament system. And now that I'm going through this, it's coming back to me. The reference that we had just a moment ago, as it is written, he hath dispersed abroad, he hath given to the poor, his righteousness remaineth forever. This is actually in connection with the gathering of the materials for the tabernacle. When God told the children of Israel, there in the book of, I think it's also in Exodus, when they're fixing to establish the tabernacle and they're needing the materials for it, Moses and the other elders did not have to go through the camp and tell everybody, here's what you need to give. Moses sent the decree out, this is what we need, the people gave to it. Not of necessity, they did so of a willing heart. Joyfully, cheerfully. Why? Because this is what God needs. This is what God has asked for, this is what He needs. And then we have that same illustration being used here. That doesn't mean that we go back there and we get the tithe. We take that learning from the Old Testament, we make application to the New Testament command here. But if you're not aware of all of this, I could come along and I could say, okay, we need to start tithing, but we're not going to do that to you. We're going to try to show you all the tricks that these individuals try to pull. Listen to the prophets. Let's go to one of his videos and let's deal with this next line of reasoning. He says, if it's not condemned in the New Testament, if it's not condemned in the New Testament, then what was in the Old Testament comes right on through. All right, well, let's listen to what he tries to use to establish that.
Now let's go to Luke 24:25, where Jesus said, all fools and slow at heart to believe all what the prophets have spoken. Now Jesus is calling you a fool if you don't believe what the prophets have spoken. All right? So, you'll find that in Luke 24:25, where Jesus was talking to the two from the road to Emmaus, and he was telling them, "O fool, slow at heart to believe all what the prophet has spoken."
So his argument is, listen to the prophets. Now, again, if you do not know what these passages are saying, you're going to be misled. He's using this in a form as saying, hey, just listen to what the prophets say, and whatever the prophets say, you do. But is this just in reference to anything and everything under the Old Testament system? Is this in any way, shape, or form connected with using mechanical instruments of music? Here's his verse. Luke 24:25, we're going to go to 27, and we're going to read to the end of 27. Then he said unto them, O fools and slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Now you see, he wants to stop right there and just say, okay, if you're not going to believe all that the prophets have spoken, then you're fools. But we find later on, Jesus makes a qualifying statement. Ought not Christ to have suffered these things and to enter into His glory? So what are we actually listening to all of the prophets about? The discussion is about Christ, His suffering, death, burial, and resurrection. And beginning at Moses and all the prophets, He expounded unto them in all the Scriptures, look at this, the things concerning Himself. Now you've got Mr. Peter Cox going here and saying, hey, we got to go back and we got to listen to all that the prophets have spoken. That's not even what Jesus said. Jesus said, you listen to what the prophets have to say as concerning me. We're not listening to everything that the prophets say, because a lot of the stuff the prophets were writing about had to do with those individuals during that time frame. But Jesus says, you listen to the prophets when it comes to me. Why? Because He's the one that we're needing to listen to once the prophets are done. It's not a situation that, oh, we're just going back and we're taking everything that the prophets are saying. If we're doing that, now he built up an argument that David is a prophet, and that's true. Acts chapter 2, Peter calls David a prophet. But if we're going to listen to the prophets, and we're going to bolster up David as being a prophet, David did some things that were not authorized. So are we going to do like that? Or we do like David did there? Listen to all the prophets? Well, look at what David did. 2 Samuel chapter 7, beginning in verse 1. It came to pass, when the king sat in his house, and the Lord had given him rest round about from all his enemies, that the king said unto Nathan the prophet, See now, I dwell in a house of cedar, but the ark of God dwelleth within curtains. Nathan said to the king, Go, do all that is in thine heart, for the Lord is with thee. So David is sitting at home. The ark of the covenant, the ark of God, is sitting in a tabernacle, is sitting in tents, and David, a prophet, gets the grand idea, you know what, I'm going to build a house for the ark of God to dwell in. Nathan the prophet, another prophet, is there with him. He says, you know what, David, that's a good idea. You go for that. The Lord is with thee. So here we have the word of two prophets, and they're both in agreement that, okay, we're going to build the Lord a house. But then look at what we have happen. And it came to pass that night that the word of the Lord came unto Nathan, saying, Go and tell my servant David, Thus saith the Lord, Shalt thou build me an house for me to dwell in? Whereas I have not dwelt in any house since the time that I brought up the children of Israel out of Egypt, even to this day, but have walked in a tent and in a tabernacle. In all the places wherein I have walked with all the children of Israel, spake I a word with any of the tribes of Israel, whom I commanded to feed my people Israel, saying, Why build ye not me an house of cedar? What do we have going on here? Well, let's listen to all the prophets, what they did. The prophets did some things when they had no authority to do it. And God even steps in and says, Who gave you the authority to do this? Now you see right there, we're already getting into how this authority thing works. God didn't say, don't build him a house. See, he didn't say not to. Well, that must mean it's okay. No. What had God already said that he wanted? What was God, in fact, satisfied with? God was satisfied with the tabernacle. David had no authority, had no word from God to come along and do this, and God even calls him out on it and says, When did I ever ask you to build me a house? So you see, we cannot just go off on our own desires and our own will, thinking, well, I think God will be happy with this. Even if we have somebody else on our team telling us, you know what, this sounds like a good idea, let's do this. If God has not said on the matter, then I need to leave it alone and just be satisfied with what God has already said. He said, build me a tabernacle. Now, he allowed the temple to be built. He went ahead and said, David, I'm not going to let you build it, but I'll let your son build it. And that ended up being to their own destruction, to their own downfall. They started trusting in the temple more than they trusted in God. It would have been better for them to have the tabernacle still standing. Why? Because it represented exactly what they were as a people. They had conquered the land, but was that land their home? Was that all there was to it? No. The tabernacle, the tent, walking about through the wilderness, it's showing that they're not in a permanent setting. Peter would say that we are to sojourn, we are to live as pilgrims and strangers. And that's what that tent represented. But once they built that temple, things started going downhill for them. They got all wrapped up in the physical element of what it was, and God never even asked for it. Now, he allowed it, just like he allowed them to have a king. Remember that? 1 Samuel, God had warned them, Moses had warned them. Don't get yourself a king. Here's what's going to happen. They get into the land. They start being victorious. And what do they say? We want a king like everybody else. What had God already said? God had already said, do not do this. But even though he had already said, do not do it, he allowed them to have it. Why? So they could learn a lesson. All right, I'll give you this temple. I didn't ask for it. I don't need it. And it's going to end up being to your own destruction. Now, where's the authority in the New Testament? Where has God said in the New Testament, worship me with mechanical instruments and music? That's what you need to find for us tonight. You need to find it in the New Testament. Now, we're listening to the prophets, remember? Jesus said, his proof text was Luke chapter 4 and verse 25. Then he said unto them, O fools and slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have spoken. All right, if you do not believe all that the prophets have spoken, Jesus says you're a fool. All right, let's listen to all that the prophets have said. If we're going to listen to all that the prophets said, we need to start sprinkling. The Methodists, Episcopalians, Roman Catholics, Greek Orthodox, anybody else that's involved in pouring over, sprinkling over their infants, which even with this information wouldn't deal with infants, it'd be dealing with grown adults. So even there, you're still wrong. But hey, at least you got the mode right. At least you got the method. The initial argument was, show in the New Testament where it's condemned. All right, we do not have, just, man, poor grammar right there. We do not have any condemnation in the New Testament that says, thou shalt not sprinkle. So that which is not condemned in the New Testament, if it's in the Old Testament, it came through. Look at what we have here. Listen to all the prophets. Numbers chapter 8, verse 5. And the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, Take the Levites from among the children of Israel, and cleanse them, and thus shalt thou do unto them to cleanse them. Sprinkle water of purifying upon them, and let them shave all their flesh, and let them wash their clothes, and so make themselves clean. All right, listen to all the prophets. If somebody comes along and tries to say, well, this is the Levites. Well, we're the spiritual priesthood today. If the physical priests are involved in this purifying and this cleansing by sprinkling, we're the spiritual priests. We're spiritual Levites. Let's sprinkle. Let's shave and wash our clothes so we might make ourselves clean. Oh, but he's not going to do that. I won't play the full clip. We won't have enough time for it. But if you remember when he called in, I tried to ask him about baptism. What's the mode? What's the method? He went a roundabout way and finally came around saying, well, it's by submersion. You have to be submerged in water. So baptism cannot be sprinkling then, because it says what it is. There's no condemnation, so why isn't sprinkling allowed? Because of what is commanded and what is authorized. That's what we have. Well, this is in the Old Testament. We're listening to the prophets. It doesn't matter. We're not back here. We're under something new that's been established with the blood of Christ. And Jesus said, you be submerged, not sprinkled. If somebody wanted to say, well, that's the Levites, that's not everybody, that's fine. We got something for you from the prophets. Numbers 19:9. And a man that is clean shall gather up the ashes of the heifer, and lay them up with the camp in a clean place, and it shall be kept for the congregation of the children of Israel for a water of separation. It is a purification for sin. Verse 16. And whosoever toucheth one that is slain with a sword in the open fields, or a dead body, or a bone of a man, or a grave, shall be unclean 7 days. And for an unclean person they shall take of the ashes of the burnt heifer of purification for sin, and running water shall be put thereto in a vessel, and a clean person shall take hyssop and dip it in the water, and sprinkle it upon the tent, and upon all the vessels, and upon the persons that were there, and upon him that touched a bone, or one slain, or one dead, or a grave. If you don't listen to all the prophets said, you're a fool. All right, and here's what Moses says about purification. It's not condemned under the New Testament, so it must have come on through, right? Wrong. That's not permission. When we have the New Testament referencing to baptism, and thus here also, you have some individuals that are trying to argue about, well, when Jesus and John were teaching All they were really teaching on was this type of stuff right here. Jewish cleansing, purification. No, that's not what they were teaching. In John chapter 3 and verse 24, 25, you have the disciples of John coming to John and asking him about purification. If what they were teaching and what they were doing, their baptism was the same as this, what's the question? What's there to mistranslate? What's there to misunderstand? It was not the same thing. I mean, look at this process right here. You take the ashes of a heifer, and that's to be in the water, and that's to be separated to use for purification? Well, John and Jesus, they're not doing that. They're just down there baptizing in the Jordan. You see, it's not the same. And then on top of that, they're immersing people. They're not sprinkling on them. There's your distinction. But if we take Peter Cox's hermeneutic or way of interpretation, gathering biblical authority, if I wanted to mislead you and I wanted to try to make room for those that do sprinkle, I could do this. I'm using all of the methods that he says. If it's not condemned under the New Testament, but it is authorized in the Old Testament, it came through. Listen to the prophets. If you don't listen to the prophets, you're a fool. Well, okay, I'm 2 for 2. Moses is a prophet. Sprinkling is not clearly condemned in the New Testament. Thus it's allowed. Nobody's going to reason that way. Because when it comes to what the Bible says, am I needing to find a thou shalt not? No, I don't. If I can find what God asks for, then that removes any other option. If God said baptize, which means immerse, to dip, dunk, submerge, then that means sprinkling is out. And Mr. Cox, he realizes this. He understands this very well. We have the passages here showing that here's Philip and the eunuch. He commanded the chariot to stop. Verse 38 here at the bottom, and they went down both into the water. No sprinkling. They both went down into the water. Romans chapter 6, 3 and 4. Therefore we are buried with him by baptism into death. Baptism is a death. Baptism is a burial. You bury dead people. You don't sprinkle dirt on top of them. Anything not specifically condemned is brought over. He caught himself on that when I end up asking him about, well, do you burn incense? Listen to what he says. Let's go back to our clip. We say we're going to use some more of it. Whoops, I didn't mean to do that. All right, bear with me. Bear with me here. Where are we? Reedsville 11:10.
Good evening, what does the Bible say?
And that's going to mess up my lineup, so let me find it here. All right, here.
And then this song
Nope.
really tells us how we...
Sorry, that's the wrong one. Here it is.
All right, good evening, caller. You're on What's the Bible Say?
All right. You said this is what the Bible saying?
This is what does the Bible say?
All right. Now, do y'all believe in mechanical instruments in worship service today?
No, we do not find the New Testament teaching that we can use mechanical instruments of music in worship today.
So what if I tell you that I can prove what mechanical instruments is not a commandment, but we have permission to use it in worship service today?
You're going to have to prove it from the New Testament.
All scriptures are given by the inspiration
No,
of God.
sir, we're not under the Old Testament today. Christ
Anything
came...
in the Old Testament, if it was said, and then if the New Testament didn't condemn it, then it mean it went on through.
No, Christ said he came to do the will of the one that sent him, and that was to do away with the first, that he might establish the second. We're not following the first, we're following...
In the Old Testament, doesn't it say, honor thy mother and father?
Jesus said that.
Did it not say in the Old Testament, in the law, to obey thy mother and father?
I just answered you, sir. Jesus said
honor
that.
thy mother and father.
Jesus said that.
Did it say it in the Old Testament?
I don't have to acknowledge that. Jesus said it.
Why you don't want to acknowledge? Because you know it went through.
I'm not listening to Moses. I'm listening to Jesus. Why are you wanting to listen to Moses?
Because anything in the Old Testament, if the New Testament didn't condemn it, mean it carried on through.
Okay, so can you offer incense? Can you burn incense to the Lord?
Now here's how I know he knows how to reason like I'm saying we need to reason. Listen to what he says here. I asked him about incense. If it's not condemned, it's brought on through.
That was condemned in the New Testament.
Where? Show me where it's condemned.
That was condemned. It
Show it to me.
No man just
Show it to me.
in a meat offering or respect for a holy day and all that.
Show me where it's condemned.
That was condemned. It
Show it to me.
No man just
Show it to me.
in a meat offering or respect for a holy day and all that.
He's trying to quote Colossians chapter 2, which he's doing a poor job of doing that. And he's claiming that he has the Holy Spirit leading him and bringing him into all remembrance of things, like what was promised to the apostles, and he can't even remember how to quote this. Colossians 2:16, let no man therefore judge you in meat or in drink or in respect of any holy day or the new moon or of the Sabbath days. Anything in here about incense burning? Is there any direct commandment that says thou shalt not burn incense in Colossians 2 and verse 16? No. No, there's not. But what does Mr. Cox understand? He understands that you have these things being mentioned, and it's going to include these other things as well. Now, why can he do that with incense, but he's not able to do that across the board? Now, he's already undone himself with his argument, with his premise. If it's not condemned and it's in the Old Testament, it came through. Listen to the prophets. David burned incense. Psalms chapter 66, 15 and 16. I will offer unto thee burnt sacrifices of fatlings, with the incense of rams I will offer bullocks with goats. Come and hear, all ye that fear God, I will declare what he hath done for my soul. David's a prophet. Listen to all that the prophets say. If it's not condemned in the New Testament, it came through, then we ought to be burning incense, per that argumentation. You don't reason that way. That's not how we get our authority. I'm not going back to the Psalms. I'm not going back to those prophets. I'm listening to the prophet that was supposed to come, that did come, and that came with all authority in heaven and in earth. I'm following his teachings. When he sent out his apostles, what did he command them to teach? He commanded them to teach others the things that he had in fact had taught them. Verse 20, teaching them to observe all things whatsoever I have commanded you. So if there are things under the Old Testament system, like for example, honoring your father and your mother, that is a moral law. That is something that is just specifically, directly right within itself. Thou shalt not kill. That was the law before the law of Moses even came along. Cain was punished for killing his brother. So you see there, murder was wrong, killing was wrong before the law of Moses ever came about. So to simply look at and say, well, this is what Moses said, we need to listen to Moses. No, there are some things that are just right all the way through. But there are some things that were given to this particular group of people for them by themselves. Deuteronomy chapter 5, verse 2 and 3. The Lord our God made a covenant with us in Horeb. The Lord made not this covenant with our fathers, but with us, even us who are all of us here alive this day. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, did they have this covenant? Did they have this law? No, they did not. Did they have laws? Yes, they did. And they had some laws that were given to them that was okay for them to do, that was not okay when the law of Moses came around. Abraham was married to his half-sister. She was the daughter of his mother. No, excuse me. The daughter of his father, but not of his mother. So Abraham marries his half-sister. When you get over into the law of Moses, you couldn't do that. You've got different things being allowed, being permitted during these different time frames, that when you come along to different things, they're no longer viable, they're no longer acceptable. So again, can we burn incense? According to Mr. Cox's reasoning, if it's not condemned and a prophet said it, then we can do it. There's no condemnation of burning incense. And not only that, you have it being found in the New Testament. Here's Revelation chapter 8, verses 3 and 4. And another angel came and stood at the altar, having a golden censer, and there was given unto him much incense, that he should offer it with the prayers of all saints upon the golden altar which was before the throne. And the smoke of the incense which came with the prayers of the saints ascended up before God out of the angel's hand. Here's the saints burning incense and making prayers. So let's start burning incense. This is not a direct command. This is figurative, signified language that's going on here in the book of Revelation. But you see, if I wanted to pull a fast one on you, and you don't know how to properly ascertain Bible authority, I could get away with it. If I had impure motives. Impure motives, or being led astray, and then on top of that, just simply not wanting to listen to what the Bible actually says. Here's Psalm 81 verses 3 and 4. Mr. Cox doesn't like the position that we present, in which actually the Bible presents that these things were given to Israel. I'm not an Israelite, I'm a Gentile. They weren't given to me. Even the prophet David says, Psalm 81 verse 3, blow up the trumpet in the new moon in the time appointed on our solemn feast days, for this was a statute for Israel and a law of the God of Jacob. It wasn't given to everybody. It was given to them so as to help separate them, distinct them, make them distinct from the other people in the land. But here's what's interesting about this verse. Blow up the trumpet in the new moon. That's one of the things that was listed back there in Colossians chapter 2 and verse 16, where he was trying to say incense is condemned. Let no man therefore judge you in meat or in drink or in respect of any holy day or of the new moon. Well, what went along with the new moon? Blowing on the trumpet. So there goes your trumpet. Now you see, he knows how to reason through this. He looks at these things and he says, okay, these things are done away with. And since these things are being done away with, what about these other things that are connected around it? They're being done away with too. Even though it's not specifically stated, we can take what's being said here and understand, all right, these are being taken out, others are being taken out. Now, I want to be honest with you as we go off here. This will be one of our final points. I realize that this does not work for all cases in all situations. Would you have something specifically stated? We're looking at Colossians chapter 3 verse 16, how it says sing. All right, since it says sing, baptism, that excludes anything else. I understand there are some realms where that's not going to work. Take Exodus chapter 23 and verse 17. 3 times in the year all thy males shall appear before the Lord God. All right, all it says is the males. The males appear. So the women are condemned from coming. No. 1 Samuel chapter 1 verses 3 through 5. And this man went up out of his city early to worship and to sacrifice unto the Lord of hosts in Shiloh. The 2 sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, the priests of the Lord, were there. And when the time was that Elkanah offered, he gave to Peninnah his wife, and to all her sons and her daughters portions. But unto Hannah he gave a worthy portion, for he loved Hannah, but the Lord had shut up her womb. Here's a man going up to worship during the feast days. Who's he got with him? He's brought his wives. Oh, well, he's sinned. He's condemned. That's not allowed. No. Luke chapter 2 and verse 41. Now his parents went to Jerusalem every year at the feast of Passover. That's exactly what we're discussing here, Luke chapter 23. So when we're looking at this command, can the women attend? Yes. Can the women stay home? Yes. Can the men stay home? No. The men had a command that they had to appear 3 times in a year for these feasts. What about the women? It's optional. How did I gather that? From the fact that you have these women showing up at these feasts and they're not being separated from it. If we had gone through the Old Testament and never found a woman showing up at the Passover feast, then what could we properly conclude? Men only. But the fact that we have the mother of Jesus coming to Passover and she's not condemned for it, then what do we have? We've ascertained Bible authority. But the problem that you have with singing, you do not find any passage in the New Testament where you have singing and playing. That's what you would have to prove in order to get permission. Have to show me from the New Testament where they're singing and playing. When I go through the New Testament and I find what the church is doing in worshiping God, singing. And that word is specific to the action of singing. You do not get singing and playing from the word singing. So tonight, as we go off, we are out of time. I appreciate you for watching. Got speeding through, forgot to put the phone lines up. I apologize for that. That was on me, didn't call for it. But we hope that if you have any comments, you'll leave them on the YouTube channel, find us on Facebook, give us a call, what have you, whatever's easiest for you. Appreciate you watching. If you have any questions on this situation of authority, I'm in communication with Mr. Cox. I don't hate him. I don't despise him. Individual on Facebook that's giving us a hard time, don't despise him either. But you don't need to be difficult. You don't need to be hard-headed and try to start binding things and holding down certain standards that you can't even hold yourself. Appreciate everybody for watching. Contact us any way that you feel free, feel like doing. And until next time, always ask for what does the Bible say. Have a good night.
The views expressed on this